Ever walked away from a connection with someone who seemed emotionally unavailable, only to be left wondering if they even cared at all? The truth is, avoidant people don't often come back with open apologies, but there is a way to flip the script. If you stop chasing and start doing these 7 things, you'll create a shift that's impossible to ignore. And often, it's the exact wake-up call that makes them realize what they lost. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away or creates emotional distance, the natural response for most people, especially those who feel deeply, is to seek reassurance. You want to know why they changed. You want to understand what you did wrong. You want some signal that they still care. And that longing leads to reaching out, explaining yourself, trying to reopen communication, and sometimes even begging for clarity. But what you might not realize is that every time you do this, you're reinforcing their belief that they hold all the power in the dynamic. They sense that you're emotionally invested while they remain detached. And unfortunately, the more you seek validation from them, the more they pull away. Because for someone who is emotionally avoidant, neediness, even perceived neediness, feels like pressure. It makes them feel cornered, and when avoidants feel emotionally cornered, they disappear. This doesn't mean your desire for closeness is wrong. It means you're handing over your emotional power in a way that they're not equipped or willing to hold. The real shift begins when you stop seeking that validation from them altogether. It starts with recognizing that the apology, the understanding, the empathy you're looking for isn't actually something they can give you right now. Not because you don't deserve it, but because they're not in the emotional place to provide it. They're not tuned in to your needs. They're tuned in to protecting their own space, their own independence, and avoiding discomfort. So the more you try to force that vulnerability, the more they recoil. Instead, the answer lies in reclaiming that attention and energy and redirecting it inward. When you stop looking at them for emotional permission, to feel better, to feel seen, to feel worthy, you stop giving them the control. Most people don't realize how much power they give away in that search for closure. They believe that healing begins when the other person validates their pain, but healing begins when you validate it. When you say to yourself, I'm hurting and that pain is real, but I don't need them to acknowledge it for me to move forward. That internal shift is magnetic. When you stop reacting to their silence, stop trying to decode their mixed signals, and start being clear with yourself about your own boundaries, they feel the shift. They sense the emotional vacuum where your energy used to go. And for the first time, instead of feeling suffocated by your presence, they begin to feel the absence of it. There's something powerful about no longer needing someone's validation to stand tall. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've made peace with not being responsible for how someone else shows up emotionally. Avoidants expect you to chase. They expect you to need their attention, to prove your value, to overextend. That's how they stay safe, by staying in control. But when you no longer need their response, when you don't initiate contact, when you don't flinch at their coldness, that balance shifts. Now you become the calm in the storm. You become the one who's emotionally grounded. That doesn't just unsettle them, it disrupts their entire pattern. This kind of calm detachment isn't easy. It takes strength to hold your boundaries when every part of you wants to reach out. It takes self-trust to say, I'm going to stop pouring into someone who's not pouring into me, even when your heart is still tangled up in what could have been. But the moment you stop seeking validation from them is the moment you stop bleeding emotionally. It's the moment your energy starts healing. And the irony? That's when avoidants begin to feel the very thing they've been running from, connection. Because now you're not emotionally reacting. You're not begging. You're not proving. You've stepped back. You've taken your worth off the table. And when that worth is no longer being constantly offered, that's when they start to recognize its value. They may not say it right away, they may not say it in words, but they feel the change, they notice your shift in energy, they wonder why the old patterns don't work anymore, and in that space, they begin to confront something they've been avoiding all along, the impact of their actions, the way they pushed away someone who actually cared, the damage their detachment caused. But none of that happens when you're still chasing their attention. It only happens when you stop needing it. Reclaiming your emotional power is not about pretending you don't care or putting on an act of indifference. It's about understanding that your well-being cannot be dependent on someone else's inconsistent behavior. When you're dealing with someone avoidant, their pattern is to pull away when things become too emotionally intense. They tend to shut down when conversations get vulnerable, when affection grows too deep, or when expectations become clear. This behavior can leave you feeling destabilized, confused, and questioning your worth. The natural impulse is to try to fix it, reach out, over-communicate, clarify your intentions, or overextend emotionally in the hope that they'll reciprocate. But this dynamic ends up becoming a trap because the more energy you put into pulling them closer, the more they lean away. They don't see your efforts as connection, they see it as pressure, and every time they sense that pressure, their response is to withdraw even further. Emotional power lies in your ability to regulate your inner world regardless of how someone else behaves. It means that whether they respond or don't, whether they validate or ghost, whether they show up with warmth or suddenly grow cold, you remain centered. That emotional steadiness is what disrupts the avoidance cycle. Most avoidants are used to the dynamic where they retreat and the other person chases. That chasing reinforces their emotional detachment because it tells them they can disengage and still remain at the center of your emotional world. But when you stop trying to manage their emotions or coax out a connection, when you choose instead to manage your own state and stay grounded in your own self-worth, you create a completely different kind of interaction, one that they don't expect and are often unprepared for. Taking back your emotional power is an internal decision. It happens when you decide you're not going to be pulled into their rhythm anymore. It happens when you realize that you can't force emotional availability out of someone who's not willing to give it. Instead of reacting to their withdrawal with anxiety or self-blame, you respond with clarity and composure. You observe their behavior without personalizing it. You recognize that their avoidance is not a reflection of your inadequacy, but of their discomfort with intimacy. And from that understanding, you begin to respond differently. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop justifying your feelings. You stop waiting for them to come back around before you feel okay again. You create your own emotional anchor so that no matter what storm they bring or what silence they offer, you don't lose yourself in it. This shift is powerful because it changes what you tolerate. You no longer settle for breadcrumbs of attention or inconsistent affection. You begin to see the pattern for what it is, a cycle that's kept you emotionally trapped. And when you step out of that cycle and reclaim your space, the avoidant person can no longer rely on your old reactions. They're left with silence instead of reassurance. They're left with questions instead of certainty. And in that space, they begin to feel the consequences of their actions in a way they didn't before, because now there's nothing buffering them from the reality they've created. There's no one trying to bridge the emotional gap. There's no one carrying the relationship for both of you. This isn't about manipulation, it's about liberation. It's about choosing not to be emotionally held hostage by someone else's fear of connection. When you reclaim your emotional power, you stop showing up in ways that beg for recognition. Instead, you show up for yourself, with respect, with consistency, with presence. You meet your own emotional needs first, and from that place, you engage with others. If someone can't meet you there, you don't collapse or chase. You simply let them go without betraying yourself in the process. This kind of presence is incredibly attractive, not just to others, but to you. You begin to feel like yourself again, not the version of you that anxiously overfunctions to win someone back, not the version that tiptoes around their moods to avoid conflict, but the version of you that knows how to hold boundaries, how to stay calm in emotional uncertainty, and how to remain deeply connected to your own sense of worth no matter who walks in or out of your life. Avoidants expect you to become reactive. They expect you to plead for answers or push for emotional connection. That's the dynamic they know, and in a strange way, it allows them to stay in control while avoiding responsibility. But when you stay grounded in your own emotional power, when you no longer respond with desperation or self-doubt, the power dynamic shifts. They're no longer in control of the narrative. You are, because you've stopped letting their behavior dictate your emotional state. You've stopped making their avoidance the center of your attention. You've chosen to step out of that emotional tug of war completely. And from that position of strength, you no longer need to demand respect. It begins to show up naturally. Mirroring someone's behavior isn't about playing games or manipulating outcomes. It's about creating a clear reflection that allows you to preserve your dignity and protect your emotional well-being. When you're dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, they often operate in extremes of closeness and distance. One moment they're engaged and seemingly connected. The next, they withdraw, shut down, or create space that feels cold and confusing. The instinct for most people is to compensate. You might send more messages, try harder to reconnect, or look for ways to get back to the emotional intimacy you had during those moments when they were more present. But this creates an imbalance. It signals to the avoidant that you're the one holding the emotional weight, that you're willing to overfunction so they can underfunction, that you're willing to pursue even as they continue to retreat. And while that may feel like the only way to keep the connection alive, it actually reinforces the very behavior that's hurting you. Mirroring their behavior shifts that dynamic without confrontation. It allows you to communicate boundaries without needing to explain them. When they become distant, instead of panicking and trying to fill the silence, you let the silence be. When they stop initiating, you stop initiating too. When they offer minimal engagement, you don't rush in to compensate for the lack, you match it. Not out of resentment, not as a punishment, but as a way to maintain your emotional equilibrium. This kind of mirroring can feel counterintuitive at first, especially if you're someone who values deep connection and communication. It might feel like you're giving up or like you're becoming emotionally cold. But what you're actually doing is rebalancing the emotional scales that have been tilted for too long. Avoidants often don't feel the impact of their distance because others bridge the gap for them. They don't feel the weight of their disengagement because someone else continues to carry the emotional labor. When you mirror their withdrawal instead of resisting it, you're allowing them to experience the true consequences of that distance. You're no longer softening the discomfort for them. You're allowing their behavior to echo back to them without interference. And in doing that, you're holding up a mirror that reflects the truth. They've disengaged from something valuable. That truth doesn't come through words or explanations. It comes through stillness, through restraint, through the absence of over-effort. This kind of mirroring requires a strong sense of self. It means trusting that you don't have to chase someone in order to be worthy of their presence. It means knowing that real connection isn't sustained by one-sided effort. And it means believing that if someone values you, they'll notice your absence just as much as your presence. By mirroring their behavior, you're not abandoning the relationship. You're stepping out of the role of emotional caretaker. You're no longer trying to manage the dynamic or preempt their detachment. Instead, you're letting the space speak for itself. And in that space, something powerful happens. The avoidant person is no longer in control of the rhythm. They can't rely on your pursuit to maintain the bond. They're left with the discomfort of emotional silence. And often, that discomfort is the only thing that interrupts their pattern. This approach doesn't guarantee an immediate change in their behavior. Avoidants may initially interpret your mirrored response as confirmation that you've lost interest, or they may retreat further. But over time, the emotional clarity it brings becomes undeniable. They start to feel the absence of your energy. They begin to question why the dynamic no longer feels the same. They become aware of the effort you used to put in, effort they may have taken for granted. And in that awareness, they begin to confront the parts of themselves they've been avoiding. Because now they're not just avoiding vulnerability, they're confronting loneliness. They're confronting the reality that connection can fade when it's not nurtured. And they're realizing that your silence isn't a tactic, it's a reflection of self-respect. Mirroring also gives you space to evaluate the relationship more objectively. Without the noise of constant overfunctioning, you can actually observe how they respond when you stop overextending. Do they notice? Do they reach out? Do they make an effort to re-engage? Or do they continue to drift without concern? These observations provide clarity, not through what they say, but through what they do when you're no longer doing all the work. And that clarity is essential for deciding whether the relationship is something you truly want to continue investing in. You're not trying to teach them a lesson. You're not withholding affection or communication as a form of punishment. You're simply meeting them at their level of engagement. And by doing that, you're communicating something much deeper than words ever could. That connection is a two-way street, and if they want to be part of it, they have to start walking in your direction. When you begin to invest in your own fulfillment, something fundamental shifts in both how you see yourself and how others experience you. Especially in the context of dealing with an avoidant person, this step is essential, not just for your healing, but for disrupting the pattern that keeps you emotionally stuck. Avoidants are often drawn to people who prioritize connection, who lead with empathy, who want to build intimacy. But when that connection becomes one-sided, when you find yourself giving more than you're receiving, it can start to erode your confidence and make you question your worth. The subtle and not so subtle ways avoidants withdraw their presence, give mixed signals, or emotionally shut down can leave you in a constant state of wondering, what did I do wrong? How do I fix this? How can I get them to open back up? That cycle becomes dangerous because it takes all of your energy and redirects it toward managing someone else's emotional limits. It becomes about what they're thinking, what they're feeling, when they'll come around again. You start analyzing every word, every text, every pause. You lose touch with your own inner compass. Your identity begins to orbit around how they treat you and how you respond to that treatment. And that is exactly the dynamic you need to break. Because the moment you start investing in your own joy, in your own goals, in your own well-being, is the moment you stop needing their approval to feel good about yourself. This kind of self-investment isn't superficial. It's not about distraction or filling time so you don't think about them. It's about coming home to yourself. It's about reconnecting with the parts of you that existed before you got caught in their emotional maze. Think about the things you used to love doing, the interests you had before their presence took up so much mental and emotional space. Maybe it's something creative or something physical or something social. Maybe it's a career goal you paused or a routine you let slip or a boundary you stopped honoring. When you start pouring energy back into these areas, you're sending yourself a message. I matter, my needs matter, my life matters beyond this relationship dynamic. Avoidants tend to respond to pressure with distance, but they also respond to self-possession with intrigue. When you begin to thrive independently, emotionally, mentally, physically, you shift out of the role they've placed you in. You're no longer the anxious one, the chaser, the one holding all the emotional weight. You become someone who is emotionally centered, someone who doesn't rely on external reassurance to feel whole. That's incredibly powerful, because when someone who's avoidant sees that you're no longer seeking their engagement as a measure of your self-worth, it creates a rupture in the cycle. They expect to be chased. They expect to be the emotional sun around which you revolve. But when you become your own center, they're forced to look at you differently. There's something deeply attractive about someone who's focused on their own growth, someone who walks into a room with purpose, someone who has plans, passions, direction, someone who's not constantly trying to decode another person's emotional state because they're too busy building something meaningful. That kind of energy doesn't chase, it draws others in. And for the avoidant person, who often feels safest when they're not needed, this shift can feel confusing and confronting. They're no longer being emotionally pursued. They're no longer being fed a steady stream of validation. Instead, they're watching from the sidelines as you move forward with your life. And that contrast, the you who once waited, now choosing yourself, creates a powerful reflection. Investing in your fulfillment also gives you perspective. It allows you to view the relationship and the person through a clearer lens. You stop idealizing them. You stop placing them on a pedestal. You begin to see the cracks in the dynamic and realize you don't need to shrink or chase or overcompensate to be loved. You begin to understand that your emotional hunger wasn't a reflection of your weakness, but a signal that your needs weren't being met. And when you start meeting those needs yourself, through connection with others, through purpose, through presence, you become emotionally self-sufficient in the best way. This is the part of the process that not only helps you heal, but also quietly demands respect. not through confrontation, not through ultimatums, but through example. Because when you show that your life has expanded instead of collapsed in their absence, you reframe the narrative completely. You stop being the person waiting for them to notice your worth, and you become the person living in it. And when someone sees you doing that, especially someone who once felt in control of the emotional dynamic, it shakes their certainty. It makes them reflect. It makes them question what they ran from and what they might be missing now that you're no longer standing still. Responding instead of reacting is one of the most difficult shifts to make when dealing with someone who's emotionally avoidant, but it's also one of the most powerful. Reactions are impulsive. They're emotional bursts driven by pain, fear, or insecurity. They come from a place of urgency. When something happens that hurts or triggers you, your nervous system jumps into defense mode, and suddenly you're sending long messages, making emotional demands, or spiraling in overthinking. Reactions are about control. They're your attempt to get a handle on a situation that feels unstable. And when someone is avoidant, these reactions don't land the way you want them to. Instead of drawing them closer, they often make them shut down even more. They don't see your emotional expression as vulnerability. They see it as pressure. They don't feel your pain as a call for connection. They feel it as something they need to escape from. When you learn to respond instead of react, you're no longer playing into the emotional volatility that often defines this kind of dynamic. You're stepping back from the edge. You're taking a breath before you speak. You're observing the situation for what it is, rather than what you wish it would be. This isn't about suppressing your emotions or pretending you don't care. It's about choosing intentionality over immediacy. It's about giving yourself space between the feeling and the action, space to decide how you want to show up, rather than letting the other person's behavior dictate your state. This emotional pause is transformative because it puts you back in control. Not control over the other person, but control over yourself. And that's the kind of control that actually creates attraction, respect, and curiosity. When someone avoidant pulls away, they often expect a reaction. They expect anger, confusion, pleading, or a flood of questions. That's the pattern they're used to. It reinforces their belief that emotional closeness comes with volatility, and it justifies their need to retreat. But when you respond instead, when you acknowledge the distance and still remain calm, grounded, and self-respecting, they're forced to reassess. Suddenly, their behavior doesn't provoke the chaos they anticipated. You don't collapse. You don't chase. You don't try to make sense of the silence with emotional overexposure. You simply respond with presence, with strength, and with restraint. A response can look like a thoughtful message instead of a reactive rant. It can look like choosing silence when you know speaking would only escalate things. It can look like saying, "I'm going to give this space," instead of sending a string of texts asking for answers. It's the difference between defending your value and demonstrating it. Avoidants don't respond well to emotional flooding, but they notice when you hold your own. They notice when you stop explaining yourself. They notice when you start choosing peace over performance. And in that stillness, they begin to feel something they don't usually feel: safe. Not safe in the sense that they can continue avoiding, but safe in the sense that your energy doesn't threaten their autonomy. Safe in the sense that you're not trying to control or fix them. You're simply holding your ground, and that's more disarming than any argument or emotional plea could ever be. Responding also keeps you anchored in your own reality. Instead of spiraling into assumptions or catastrophizing their silence, you stay focused on what's true for you, what you need, what you want, what your boundaries are. That clarity protects you from the emotional chaos that often comes with dealing with someone inconsistent. It allows you to make decisions based on your values, not based on their behavior. You stop trying to decode them and start listening to yourself. You stop chasing closure and start creating emotional stability from within. This kind of emotional intelligence is rare. It's not about being cold or detached. It's about being deliberate. It's about understanding that not everything requires your immediate engagement. Not every message needs an instant reply. Not every silence deserves to be filled. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait, not out of passivity, but out of power. You wait to see how they show up. You wait to see what their actions reveal. You wait before choosing your words so that when you do speak, it comes from clarity, not chaos. Avoidants are used to being emotionally pursued. They're used to others adjusting themselves to maintain the relationship. But when you learn to respond instead of react, you're no longer playing that role. You've stepped outside of their emotional framework and built your own. One where your peace isn't dependent on their presence. One where your voice isn't raised just to be heard. One where your worth is steady even when their behavior isn't. And in that calmness, in that grounded energy, you become someone they can't quite categorize because you're not operating on their emotional terms anymore. You've changed the rhythm, you've slowed the urgency, you've chosen to respond with intention, and that choice shifts everything. When you stop flinching at their coldness, something subtle but incredibly powerful begins to take shape. Avoidant individuals often rely on the emotional reactions of others to affirm that they are still in control. Their withdrawal, emotional distance, or inconsistency often provokes a cycle where the other person feels compelled to work harder, prove their worth, or chase the connection in an attempt to bring back the warmth they once felt. That emotional withdrawal functions like a trigger. It sends the message that something is wrong, and if you care enough, you'll be the one to fix it. And for anyone who is emotionally available and desires connection, the instinct to flinch, whether through worry, anger, or sadness, is a natural one. But it also plays directly into the dynamic the avoidant person is subconsciously maintaining. Your reaction becomes their reassurance. Not the kind that creates closeness, but the kind that signals they still have emotional influence without having to give anything in return. When you stop reacting to their coldness, when you stop making their distance the center of your focus, you disrupt this pattern completely. You're no longer performing for their attention. You're no longer modifying your tone, your availability, or your needs just to avoid triggering their withdrawal. Instead, you're staying calm, grounded, and present with yourself, even in the face of emotional absence. This doesn't mean you don't feel hurt. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you've decided that their emotional fluctuations don't get to hijack your peace. You're no longer interpreting their silence as a sign that you must do more. You're not assigning meaning to their detachment that undermines your self-worth. You're observing it for what it is, an avoidance of emotional intimacy, not a reflection of your value. This shift in behavior is not about punishment, it's about preservation. You're preserving your own energy, your self-respect, and your emotional clarity. When you flinch, when you over-respond to their coldness, you abandon yourself. You leave your own emotional center in an attempt to rescue the relationship or make sense of their behavior. And the more you do that, the more invisible you become, to them and to yourself. But when you stay rooted in who you are, when you respond to their coldness with stillness instead of panic, it creates a very different experience. You're no longer acting out of fear of loss. You're holding yourself in the middle of discomfort. And that kind of emotional strength doesn't go unnoticed. Avoidant individuals often expect others to overfunction in the relationship. They expect emotional pursuit. They expect the other person to adjust, to absorb the tension, to do the emotional heavy lifting. So when you stop reacting, when you don't try to fix or chase or over-explain, it disrupts that narrative. Suddenly, they are left to sit with their own emotional choices. They feel the impact of their coldness, not because you point it out, but because you don't respond the way they expect. And that contrast begins to create discomfort, not for you, but for them. They start to feel the distance they created in a new way, because now there's no one trying to bridge it for them. This emotional discipline isn't about being emotionally unavailable yourself. It's about being emotionally self-regulated. It's about understanding that your calmness is not a lack of care. It's a reflection of confidence. You're not swinging between extremes based on their behavior. You're steady. You're grounded. And that creates safety, not just for you, but ironically, even for them. Because deep down, avoidant people are not avoiding you. They are avoiding the vulnerability within themselves. When they see that your emotional world isn't volatile, when they see that you don't panic when they retreat, it challenges their assumptions about intimacy. It reveals that closeness doesn't have to be chaotic, that connection doesn't have to mean control, that emotional expression doesn't have to lead to overwhelm. This kind of presence doesn't demand attention. It commands it, not through force, but through its absence of need. You're not asking them to change. You're not lecturing them on what they're doing wrong. You're just refusing to let their distance dictate how you feel about yourself or how you show up in the relationship. You're no longer orbiting around their moods. You're standing still in your own space, anchored in your own values, and allowing them to meet you there, or not. That calm confidence is rare, especially in the face of emotional coldness. And it creates a new kind of tension, one that doesn't push them away, but draws their attention inward, because now they're left alone with their silence.